Subcommittee on Intergovernmental Affairs of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform and the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security of the Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Before I begin my opening remarks, I would like to recognize United States Capitol Police Canine Technician Jason Conlon and his four-legged partner, Jax. Thank you for coming, and Jax is pretty popular in this hearing. I thank you both for attending today's hearing. I think I speak for all of my colleagues here today when I say thank you for all you do to protect the complex in this nation. And having been one of the Republican members on the baseball field that morning, I know the willingness of the Capitol Police to pay the ultimate sacrifice for us, and that's literally what Officers Greiner and Bailey did. They put themselves in harm's way for us, and we are all profoundly grateful for the service of our Capitol Police. Technician Conlon and Jax are an important reminder that canines are an integral part of our national security framework and serve in all levels of our government. From the United States Capitol to local municipalities, canine teams are working to save lives every single day. Dogs like Jax provide unmatched capabilities to secure our safety, including the detection of explosives, narcotics, concealed humans, currency, firearms, electronics, and chemicals, and are also used in search and rescue missions. Simply put, canines are an invaluable asset to our country. Over recent years, international demand for canines has increased dramatically. Experts report that this heightened demand has led to a shortage of suitable canines, making it difficult for the United States government to obtain the working dogs it needs. TSA has reported that the federal government is working to improve and expand relationships with domestic vendors. This is a step in the right direction, but more work needs to be done. Efforts to obtain more dogs have reportedly been slow to materialize. In a May 18, 2017 hearing, TSA's Threat Assessment Division Director Melanie Harvey testified that TSA is working very closely with domestic vendors to build up the canine supply, but has not identified a large enough supply to domestically do that. Industry professionals and domestic vendors have also reported difficulties in working with the government's canine procurement program, citing challenges in getting their dogs accepted for work. We are hoping today's hearing will serve as a starting point toward resolving those challenges. My primary hope for this hearing is that it will help us evaluate how we can increase the use of canines in areas that are clearly vulnerable to attack, including public areas of our airports, train stations, as well as other areas with high concentrations of people. To that end, we have a diverse panel of professionals today who will present information and ideas about how our government uses canines, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say. We must ensure that government agencies are able to purchase qualified canines so that they can meet their critical national security missions. I thank Chairman Katko for his leadership and partnership on this issue. I thank Ranking Member Demings. I've had extensive conversations with both of them that really led to this hearing, and I am very grateful for the work that they put in on this. Clearly, this is an area that we can all agree deserves our attention and support. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Intergovernmental Affairs, Ms. Demings, for her opening statement.
Thank you to our witnesses for joining us here today. Before we begin, I do want to take just a moment to acknowledge the tragedy that occurred in Las Vegas. I imagine that we all have reflected on what happened, and as a former chief of police, I can tell you I have had many sleepless nights wondering what I could do to keep my community safe, let alone trying to understand what would lead somebody to commit such an unspeakable act. When President John F. Kennedy was speaking of foreign threats, I believe his words go to the heart of what each first responder holds within to do their own work. I quote him, "We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship to keep America safe." With that, I turn back to the subject for which we are here today. On this day, we have the opportunity to discuss the crucial role that canine security plays in protecting our local airports, transportation hubs, sports arenas, stadiums, and other large venues. Prior to serving as Orlando's police chief, I served as commander of the Special Operations Division, where I had the honor of managing our canine operation. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle argue that more canine security is needed. I agree. Unfortunately, the president's budget proposal would cut state and local programs. Under the budget proposal, TSA's visible and intermodal prevention and response teams, which patrol public spaces and airports, train and bus stations, would be eliminated. Under the budget proposal, the Law Enforcement Officer Reimbursement Program, which provides support to local airports by placing local law enforcement teams alongside TSA checkpoint officers, would be gutted. This would cut $45 million in funding that reimburses local police departments for canine security at more than 300 local airports. I believe such cuts would put our state and local security forces in jeopardy. Our nation's security is my top priority and should be Congress's #1 priority. Congress must stand with state and local police. And with that, I again thank our chairman for this opportunity and thank our witnesses for sharing their testimony today. And I look forward to this very important discussion. Thank you.
I now recognize the chairman of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security, Mr. Katko, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I proceed, I do want to acknowledge the tragedy in Las Vegas. As a federal organized crime prosecutor for 20 years, I made it my life's mission to take dangerous weapons out of the hands of dangerous people. But this gentleman points up a specifically difficult person to detect, and we have to learn how to do better to detect people like that have gone off the grid, so to speak. So with that, I'll talk to a little happier subject, and that's dogs. My dog Sadie's happy I'm here today. I told her before I came down, my black lab, that I'd be testifying, I'd be asking questions of all of you, and she said to say hello. Canines are an essential asset to our national security. Due to their intelligence, superior sense of smell, and versatility, canines provide an unparalleled service to law enforcement. When canines' natural abilities are supplemented by selective breeding, training, and cutting-edge developments in science, they become one of the most effective security tools for public safety. While the utility of one certain technology over another does ebb and flow based on how terrorists seek to do harm, the security benefits of canines will always be a crucial element to keeping Americans safe. And I want to commend my colleague to my left here, Mr. Rogers, who has been championing this cause for many years, at least since I've been in Congress the last 3 years, and I know long before that as well. The concept of a working dog is not unfamiliar to most Americans. They are a viable presence in airports, train stations, and other public areas. From my experience as chairman of the Homeland Security Committee's Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security, I've seen firsthand the data proving the security effectiveness of canines in mitigating the rapidly evolving threat landscape facing America's transportation systems. Oftentimes, canines present the most effective and efficient means of detecting new threats. Again, I stress, effective and efficient, as they can be retrained and deployed as new threat streams and terrorist tactics emerge. Canines are utilized in a variety of different settings and roles for the detection of people, narcotics, and explosives and weapons of mass destruction, amongst many other items. As we strive to be proactive in mitigating threats to the traveling public in transit hubs, airports, and other venues, canines are an essential component of our ability to enhance security. Because of their versatility and reliability, canines are increasingly sought after by federal, state, local, and tribal agencies, as well as private stakeholders and foreign governments. This spike in demand for both canines domestically and internationally far outstrips our current ability to produce an adequate supply of dogs. The United States is competing with many other nations to procure canines that meet rigorous standards, and a shortage of quality dogs presents an impending security risk. In an era of heightened terrorist activities, it is critical that the domestic working canine industry has a robust development and training pipeline that feeds into a seamless procurement process. The purpose of today's hearing is to learn more about the challenges that the canine industry faces. We also want to ascertain how we can better develop a strategy and more reliable infrastructure for domestic breeders and training facilities. Lastly, we want to learn how the United States government can better communicate its needs with its private sector canine partners to help facilitate future growth of this essential security asset. A strong domestic breeding industry not only makes all of us safer, but creates new jobs and opportunities in our communities. I think it'd be great if we got to a point where we stopped importing dogs from Belgium and wherever else and had the programs here, and maybe got it to such a point where we're exporting them to around the world because the quality is that good. However, we have to make sure our government is doing everything it can to present a strategic and comprehensive vision for its canine needs, and that this vision is effectively communicated to the industry in order to foster necessary growth. We must also ensure that with the rapid increase in demand for canines, we are ensuring the quality of our security standards and procuring only the most highly trained canines. We must also ensure that we are properly incentivizing breeders and trainers to meet the demand for canines today and far into the future. Ms. Goff, Lieutenant Smith, and Dr. Otto, I encourage all of you today to be candid and frank in your testimony. We convened this hearing in order to hear directly from each of you about how Congress can better support this critical layer of our national security. We all share the same goals, and we all want to better understand what obstacles currently exist that may prevent the growth of our domestic canine industry. Canines are an invaluable safety and security asset, and the need for more canines will only continue to grow. I would like to thank my colleagues, Chairman Palmer, Ranking Member Demings, and Ranking Member Watson-Coleman for joining me in calling for this hearing today. Security is not a partisan issue. That's one of the things we truly enjoy about Homeland Security, is that it's not a partisan issue. And we must work together in a bipartisan fashion to advance important issues that affect the safety and security of all Americans. And with that, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the members of both subcommittees for convening this hearing and to the witnesses for being here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Sunday's horrific mass shooting in Las Vegas as well. Our thoughts and our prayers are with the victims, their families, and their loved ones. I also want to thank the law enforcement officers and first responders who bravely rushed to the scene and attended to the victims. While we are still learning the details of this tragic event, it is a sobering reminder of the harm a single actor can cause when he has violent intent, and access to deadly weapons. Sunday's attack comes a little more than a year after the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. Until Sunday, the Pulse attack was the deadliest mass shooting in modern American history. Lieutenant Smith, I understand you were part of the law enforcement response to that shooting, and I thank you for your service. While it may not be the stated topic of this hearing, considering recent events and the renewed urgency to take up comprehensive gun safety reform, Lieutenant Smith, I hope that we can hear from you today on some of the lessons you learned from that tragic experience and some of the suggestions you have for my colleagues here in Congress on what we can do to address this epidemic of gun violence. While we may never know what drove the killer to indiscriminately fire upon concert goers, what is undeniable is that it terrorized innocent, law-abiding citizens. Congress has an obligation to pass common sense gun control reforms to reduce the lethality of future attacks. As a ranking member of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Service, I am all too familiar with the diverse security threats our nation faces. While this shooting shows that any large gathering can be targeted for attack, terrorists continue to place particular importance on attacking transportation systems. Soft targets such as subways, mass transit stations, and public airport areas have been targeted in the United States and abroad. Securing these critical transportation systems requires a layered, risk-based approach. While no one technology or solution can provide unbeatable security, canines have proven to be one of the most effective tools for securing large venues open to the public. Under the Obama administration, the TSA more than doubled the size of its canine program, growing from the number of canine teams from 518 in 2008 to 1,047 in 2017. At my home airport of Newark Liberty International Airport, TSA now deploys 13 canines to support their operations. TSA provides an additional 20 canines to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for deployment at all of its transportation systems. Although I have been pleased by the continued investment in canines, I must note that they have been deployed disproportionately to securing aviation compared to other transportation sectors. TSA devotes more attention and resources to aviation than service transportation in general. Many of the TSA's technologies that are in use at airport security checkpoints cannot be effectively integrated into bustling train stations and other active surface transportation venues. However, canines are mobile and able to detect explosives both on persons and in baggage. They work well in crowds, and they can be trained to detect evolving threats. There is also some evidence that they serve as a deterrent to those who may be planning an attack. TSA must devote more of its resources to securing surface transportation systems, particularly in light of AQAP's publication of its latest issue of Inspire magazine last August, which encouraged and provided instructions for attacks against U.S. railways. Ensuring that there are dedicated canine resources available to help secure high-risk surface transportation would be a perfect place to start. To that end, I will be introducing a bill to revamp and invest in surface transportation security programs in the near future, and I hope my colleagues will give it their support. Again, thank you to the witnesses for appearing here today, and I look forward to learning more about the capabilities and the contributions of canines to our national security. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentlewoman. I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses. Ms. Sheila Goff, Vice President of Government Relations for the American Kennel Club, Lieutenant Scott Smith, or the Orlando, Florida Police Department, and Dr. Cynthia Otto, Executive Director of the Penn Vet Working Dog Center at the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to Oversight Committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. The record will reflect all witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. As a reminder, turn on your microphones when you're testifying. The clock in front of you shows you your remaining time for giving your testimony. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up, and then the gavel will remind you that the light turned red. I'd like to recognize the witnesses for their testimony. Ms. Goff, if you would.
Thank you. Chairman Palmer, Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Demings, and Watson Coleman, and other distinguished guests. It's a pleasure to be here in Washington today. And on behalf of the American Kennel Club, I thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of our concerns and experiences with respect to the need, demand for, and use of military working dogs, particularly explosives detection dogs, and ways that improving the domestic sourcing of detection dogs can help protect our national security. The American Kennel Club was founded in 1884 by a group of sportsmen and dog enthusiasts who wished to record and preserve the bloodlines of their working dogs and advance the capabilities for future generations. Today, more than 130 years later, the AKC remains dedicated to protecting and advancing the unique capabilities of purpose-bred dogs as part of our mission of promoting purebred dogs and thoughtful, purposeful breeding for type and function. The AKC is a not-for-profit organization and national club of more than 5,000 member and affiliated clubs around the country. In 2016, AKC sanctioned 22,000 dog-related events throughout the country in disciplines ranging from conformation dog shows to field trials, agility, and obedience. Earlier this year, we established a competitive sport based on scent detection. AKC is also the largest all-breed registry in the world. We are dedicated to advocating for the purebred dog as a working and family companion, advocating for canine health and well-being, advancing the study and breeding of purebred dogs, and promoting responsible dog ownership. We have a long history of helping the government with military working dog programs. In World War II, some 17,000 AKC-registered dogs served in the Dogs for Defense program. In the last decade, AKC board member Carmen Battaglia has been an advisor to the TSA breeding program at Lackland Air Force Base, providing expertise on breeding strategies and puppy-raising protocols, such as early neurological stimulation to improve long-term outcomes for successful military working dogs. Over the course of this interaction, AKC was asked how we might be able to assist with the development and procurement of quality, domestically bred dogs suitable for training as military working dogs. The AKC does not sell dogs, nor do we seek to become a government contractor. The AKC brings a breadth of knowledge, a large network of breeders, and the expertise and ability to facilitate among a range of stakeholders. We see our role as a facilitator who can provide expertise and information to breeders to bring them together with cutting-edge research in agencies that need very specific types of dogs that can succeed as military working dogs. As mentioned earlier, military working dogs play a critical role in our national security. According to sources within and outside the federal government, 80 to 90% of the dogs purchased by the Homeland Security and Department of Defense come from foreign sources. As Americans, we should be concerned that an extraordinarily high percentage of the dogs that serve on the front lines of protecting the public, our public institutions, and our national security are obtained from foreign sources. About a year ago, AKC formed a team to gather information about American use and procurement of explosives detection dogs, the challenges faced in having enough fully trained, deployable dogs to meet demand, and how changes in breeding and procurement might improve outcomes. We met with officials at the Department of Defense, the TSA, private vendors, government and private contractors, academia, and law enforcement. We found a range of concerns regarding an over-reliance on foreign-bred and procured dogs, a lack of transparency and consistency in the selection process for untrained or green dogs. We found high failure rates among both foreign and domestic dogs, and procurement processes that intimidated potential suppliers and could favor foreign dogs over domestically bred dogs. We also heard concerns that outcomes from scientific research on improving performance and efficiency within our training programs were not being implemented consistently. In March, AKC hosted the U.S. Dog Detection Conference in Raleigh, North Carolina. The conference assembled key stakeholders from government, academia, the private sector to discuss ways that AKC could provide dogs to protect the safety and security of the United States and advance the concept of a working dog center of excellence. We plan to make this conference an annual event and would like to extend an invitation to the conference and to members of the House Homeland Security and Oversight and Government Reform Committees and appropriate staff to attend our next conference. At this conference, and I know Dr. Cindy Otto will also speak about this, we looked at a number of challenges and a number of opportunities. We looked at ways that we could come together to provide the expertise, the knowledge, the training, the cutting-edge science, all together as part of a Center for Canine Excellence for Working Dogs. We plan to continue to work towards that future, and I would be very happy to answer any questions you might have about the specifics of the plans to bring together this expertise and the ways that we would like to be able to assist in this process. Thank you very much.
The chair recognizes Lieutenant Smith for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Palmer. And I'd also like to thank the members of the subcommittees for inviting me here today, and specifically Ranking Member Demings. The connection is not lost on me why I'm sitting here in front of you. My name is Scott Smith. I'm a lieutenant with the Orlando Police Department. I've been in law enforcement for 25 years, all of which have been done in Orlando, Florida. Throughout the years, I've had an opportunity to hold a variety of jobs within our agency, but by far the most rewarding and the most challenging has been supervising the canine unit. I'd like to take the next couple of minutes to explain to you our uses of canine in Orlando and also explain a couple of unique security concerns in the Central Florida region and how we address those with the canines. The Orlando Police Department utilizes 14 full-service canines in their day-to-day operations. These full-service canines are primarily used to support patrol personnel in search and apprehension of criminals. They are trained and tested in disciplines such as area searches, building searches, tracking, and apprehension. In addition to the above functions, each of these canines also possess a secondary specialty and are trained in either narcotics detection or explosive detection. Over the years, as the paradigm has shifted from a war on drugs to a war on terror, so too has our focus on secondary specialties. In the early years of our program, almost all of our canines were trained on narcotics detection. Now, in the aftermath of such events as the '93 World Trade Center bombing, the Manchester Arena bombing, Brussels Airport, and the coordinated terrorist attacks in Paris, France that used numerous suicide vests, the Orlando Police Department Canine Unit concentrates heavily on the explosive detection specialty. In addition to the 14 full-service canines that I mentioned above, the Orlando Police Department also utilizes 4 single-purpose explosive detection dogs. These 4 canines are only trained on explosive odor and were specifically purchased to bolster the security measures at Orlando International Airport. They maintain a visible presence throughout the airport and actively sweep passengers in common landside areas such as ticketing, baggage claim, and the food and retail areas. As has been demonstrated in past terror events, whether it's ISIS or a lone extremist, mass transit facilities such as an international airport are a favorite target. It can shut down an entire transit system as well as ensure a large amount of casualties. Due to the unique tourism industry of Central Florida, Orlando International Airport has continued to grow and has set daily passenger records throughout 2017. In addition, the Orlando International Airport is currently in phase 1 of a brand new international terminal scheduled to open in 2020. With the expansion of the airport and the increased passenger numbers it will bring, the demand for security screenings will only increase. Local and federal agencies will be forced to grow in order to support these security demands. By utilizing canine assets, agencies can offset manpower demands and screen a wider number of people faster. In addition to our international airport, Central Florida is home to several of the top tourist destinations in the world. For the past 3 years, the Central Florida region has surpassed its tourist numbers from 62 million in 2014 to 68 million in 2016. On a daily basis, local law enforcement canine teams are patrolling theme parks such as Walt Disney World, Universal Studios, and SeaWorld. And at times, a particular theme park can register as many as 250,000 guests in their parks at one time. Due to these numbers, some of these theme parks even supplement the law enforcement explosive detection teams with their own supply of explosive detection canines. And although these personnel are not sworn law enforcement, it enables the theme parks to show a greater presence and screen a greater number of visitors at their turnstiles. On top of the concentration of theme parks in Central Florida, Orlando is also a host to a number of collegiate and professional athletic events. Our explosive detection dogs sweep 41 home games for the Orlando Magic, 19 home games for Orlando City Soccer, 12 for Orlando Pride, plus 3 NCAA bowl games. Orlando is also currently the host city for the NFL Pro Bowl. Attendance at these games can range from 5,000 to 70,000. Numbers like those seen at theme parks and sporting events are often too tempting to ignore for an extremist or an individual. The visible presence and active screening of canine teams at choke points at these venues is an invaluable deterrence to the safety of the visitors. Lastly, as everyone knows, on June 12, 2016, Orlando fell victim to the largest terrorist attack on U.S. soil since 9/11. A self-radicalized extremist murdered 49 victims at a small nightclub just outside downtown Orlando. The terrorist boldly made claims of possessing suicide vests as well as having a car bomb parked outside. Several canine teams from different agencies across Central Florida responded to that event. The suspect's car was swept, as well as key areas around the nightclub, such as command posts, staging areas, and staging areas. Ultimately, his claims of explosives proved to be false, but the use of responding canine teams helped alleviate the concerns of first responders about secondary devices and allowed them to concentrate on the terrorist himself. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize the ever-changing tactics used by extremist groups who frequently seek out soft targets with large number of victims. The threat to these targets can be greatly mitigated by the use of explosive detection canines. The simple sight of a canine vehicle or a canine team patrolling a choke point can deter even the most dedicated terrorists if they believe they will be detected before they can cause the greatest amount of damage. Those that seek to harm us need to know we will use the best assets available to prevent their attacks and preserve life. Again, I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to speak in front of you, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. The chair recognizes Dr. Otto for her testimony.
Chairman Palmer, Ranking Member Demings, Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Watson-Coleman, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The Penn Vet Working Dog Center is the nation's premier research and educational facility dedicated to harnessing the unique strengths of our canine partners and producing an elite group of scent detection dogs for public health and safety. The Working Dog Center is a living laboratory where we study and test strategies to optimize canine health and performance from 8 weeks of age through career entry. Early training provides a positive learning environment and mitigates problems. This, combined with placing dogs in their chosen careers, ranging from explosive detection to cancer detection, has resulted in 93% of our dogs graduating into detection careers. Dogs are a force multiplier. Dogs are diverse in their skills and applications in which dogs support national security directly and indirectly are constantly expanding. The most obvious direct applications are the explosive detection canine and the law enforcement canine. Many of the other jobs, such as narcotics detection, agriculture, search and rescue, human remains detection, and even conservation dogs, indirectly support national security. The demand for working dogs in other fields is also great. Dogs that could serve in national security careers may instead be sold to organizations or individuals that utilize dogs for other detection roles, hunting, or sport. Overall, there is a great and increasing demand for dogs with the health, behaviors, and skills necessary for a wide array of working careers, and currently, there is no comprehensive plan to increase the supply of these invaluable canines or conduct the research to enhance their success. With the high demand for dogs, one of the challenges faced is the affordable procurement of healthy dogs capable of performing the tasks required. In seeking a solution, we must consider the cost of the dogs and the source of the dogs. There are several components that contribute to the cost of a dog. The first is in identifying dogs for potential purchase. The purchase price of both successful dogs and those that eventually fail must also be tracked. Once a dog is acquired, the expense of training, medical care, housing, transportation, and working lifespan of the dog should be included. Finally, one of the biggest factors in the cost of the working dog is the cost of the human partner. In summary, the initial price of the dog is a small fraction of the total cost of employing a detection canine. Wise choices on the health and training of the dogs and selection of the handler can help to reduce the lifetime costs of dogs. The main options for sourcing dogs are imports, domestic breeders, shelter dogs, or a dedicated breeding program. Traditionally, the majority of dogs for the U.S. military and domestic law enforcement agencies have been imported. Challenges with imports stem from a lack of control over genetics, health, environment, and availability. The current challenge with relying on domestic breeders is production of top hunting dogs is typically their primary goal. Thus, cost and selection criteria often don't align with government needs. A shelter model is emotionally appealing, but limited by cost and availability of appropriate dogs, making it unsuitable as a primary source of dogs. A dedicated breeding program would allow for control of genetics, environment, and training, and potentially meet the demands for dogs in a variety of careers. Development of a breeding cooperative would allow breeders and organizations to sell dogs that meet the health, behavioral, and genetic requirements. For this program to be effective, additional and ongoing research will be necessary. In conclusion, to improve the availability and success of working dogs, supporting our national security in an efficient and cost-effective manner, sound scientific principles must be applied to all aspects of dog selection, training, and deployment. To achieve the full potential, a federally hosted collaboration between academic institutions, government agencies, organizations, breeders, and industry to create a National Detection Dog Center of Excellence is critical. The Center of Excellence would research, validate, and disseminate best practices to advance the scientific approach to dog selection, care, and training. Furthermore, to address the impending crisis of detection dog availability, a new cooperative model of detection dog breeding, early training, and distribution must be critically evaluated. Included in the documents is a white paper describing a cooperative breeding program that we presented at the AKC Summit last March. We thank you for the opportunity to present and welcome your questions and comments.
I thank the witnesses for their testimony. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Goff, when you were speaking, you reminded me of one of my early jobs as a young teenager working at AKC events in the central New York area. I was excited to go work with dogs until I got there and found out what the job was. Wearing your white coat and a large shovel and a big bucket, you can guess what I had to do all day, every day. But it's an early exposure to AKC and the professionalism of the organization, and I'm impressed with that. Dr. Otto, your testimony was excellent, and it was very helpful because we do need a blueprint, and I think we all agree that increasing the use of canines in law enforcement and anti-terror efforts is preferable over fancy new machines that rarely work as advertised. And they are more pliable, more able to adapt, and cost-effective as well. So I don't think there's an argument about that. The question is, why aren't we getting there? And you both touched on it. But I think one of the big things that I'm concerned with is some of the bottlenecks and some of the inconsistencies and some of the sheer incompetence in the procurement process. We see that again and again in Homeland Security, in other areas, but the procurement process with respect to the dogs provides a disincentive for breeders to get into this field. So we got to fix that, and I'd like to hear from you about that. And then if there's anything you'd like to drill down on with respect to your testimony, Dr. Otto, I'd like to hear that. So Ms. Goff, if you want to expound on the procurement process for me first, that'd be helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you. To start with, for the procurement process, we have been looking at the opportunity to acquaint and bring many of the breeders in our network into this process. One of the issues that we've had is severalfold. One, we have many, many small breeders throughout the country who provide the types of dogs that would potentially be ideal for this process, but they don't breed a lot of dogs. They do breed high-quality dogs, so they don't necessarily have the resources. They can be intimidated, in some cases, by the government contracting process. As you know, the government contracting process has historically looked for large quantities of dogs. And one of the ways that we think we can help address this problem is to make some changes in the processing or the contract process program so that small breeders potentially working together can actually provide dogs that are needed, the type of dogs that are needed. Another comment that we heard was from some vendors around the country who had mentioned that in order to scale up, to develop the types of dogs with the health protocols, you know, the scientific background, looking at the genetics of the dog, looking at the pedigrees of the dog, making sure that these dogs were healthy physically and mentally, able to stand up to the rigors of day on, day off in various types of conditions out there, sniffing for explosives, that they needed a larger facility, a strong breeding program. Unfortunately, what they found was that small business set-asides got in the way of their ability to do that. When they expanded to a certain level to have the expertise that they needed to scale up, if you will, they were no longer a small business. That has also brought forward the question of, when you consider that detection canines are a critical national security resource, should they potentially be identified under a different NIS code? Currently, they're identified as live animals, which would be the same as any other animal in acquisition processes, but these animals are different. They are a key part of national security, so that the people who are providing them very well may need to have a different level of category for what constitutes a small business.
Mr. Goff, just to follow up on that, and Dr. Otto, I think I'll have to ask for your response in writing, if you would, because I'm going to run out of time if it's not covered later in the hearing. But just a question for you, Ms. Goff, to follow up on what you were saying. Do you find that different agencies have different standards, and does that contribute to the problem?
We have, we've interviewed a number of people, and we have found that there has been a lot of inconsistency, actually within and across agencies. There has been some frustration among people who would like to provide dogs that they have provided the dogs, gone down in many cases to Lackland or somewhere where the dogs would be evaluated, and they have not had a consistent testing experience. The concerns have involved complaints that the protocols used were not realistic to the needs of what that dog would actually be expected to do on a day-to-day basis. We've also heard that they were rejected without a full explanation. And part of the concern of this is we understand, not all dogs are going to make it. These are very, very specialized dogs. But we think to advance the knowledge and the learning and our ability to really have good detection dogs, we're going to want to have feedback from the federal agency so we can work together, make sure that our breeders know exactly what it is that is required in what is considered to be an untrained dog. So we're not talking about high-level security, high-level training. We're talking about basic training for these dogs, just socialization, environmental stability, the mental and physical capabilities to do what they need to do on a daily basis. And we are hearing that the evaluations have been inconsistent. It's true that some of this is subjective. You've heard the old comment that if you have 3 trainers in a room, 2 of them will agree that the other one is doing something wrong. But from the perspective of science and national security, we think that part of what a Center for Excellence can do is to establish standards that are a baseline that every dog, every green dog should be able to accomplish to make it to that first level of being accepted into a training program. And then you can carry on with additional training.
Thank you, Ms. Goff. I have many other questions, but my time has expired, so I yield back. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for his questions. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And again, to our witnesses, thank you all for being here. Lieutenant Smith, it's good to see you again. And I will start with you. Could you please, again for us, just talk about the critical role that canines play in the safety of the traveling public? And then if you would also talk a bit about where the Orlando Police Department procures its canines, and if you've seen any difference between U.S. Dogs from the U.S. versus dogs from other places like Europe.
Yes, ma'am. As far as our use in Orlando, like I addressed in my opening statement, the Orlando International Airport, we just procured those 4 single-purpose dogs. So that's a new program from us, and that, I know there's a trademark here somewhere, but it's a vapor wake terminology is what those dogs were. So that's a new training, new technique. The other 14 dogs that I talked about, they are used throughout the city in different venues to include those arenas or sporting complexes. And in downtown Orlando, you obviously know the Dr. Phillips Center, Performing Arts Center, a lot of the vigils that we have or the large, runs or Lake Eola type thing, 4th of July celebrations, anywhere that's gonna draw thousands of people, we will use those dogs in a pre-sweep. And I think that's very important. People walk by, it's the same as Jack's over here. Everybody walks in and they recognize the canine. They see it right away. I think they see, the uniform, if it says canine on there, and I addressed it earlier about a vehicle, when you park a vehicle in front of someplace like an airport terminal or something like that, and it has canine in red, that's a deterrent. Whether or not that canine's right there, if somebody drives up and they see that, they're gonna think twice, whether it's a pre-surveillance thing, an intelligence gathering thing. Unfortunately, it will only displace it. It may not prevent it entirely, but when they see it, they may pick something else besides the large-scale mass casualty place. The other part of your question was?
Procurement.
Procurement. For our full-service dogs, we go through third-party vendors. They're kind of, once you find a good one, you want to keep your hands on them. We have gone through a few vendors over the years that I've been there, and I'm sure yourself. You'll get a couple of good dogs, and then after that, the quality kind of deteriorates. You know, the quantity is definitely there, the dogs are there, but it is the quality. When the use of military working dogs and police working dogs really took off, we saw a decline in the age of the dogs that we were getting as a local agency. I think a lot of them were being used in the military, and those vendors chose to sell to them first. And then some of the dogs that we got were, instead of being 2.5, they started to be a year and a half old, or maybe just a little older. And you start to get too young, and then you run the risk of actually breaking the dog. You know, the socialization and the hard work and stuff, they won't respond to the discipline that you put on them, so.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Otto, first of all, I want to thank you so much for the work that you're doing through your nonprofit. Would you agree that many federal agencies use highly trained dogs for a variety of missions?
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that we need to consider is that we're not just selecting for one type of dog. So there may be different criteria for different agencies because they have different missions, and one of the really important things about a National Center of Excellence is that we can consider the phenotype, which is that external expression of the behavior, and associate that with the genotype, which is the genetic underpinnings, and we can start to actually select dogs for the jobs that we need them to be in. And if we have a litter of puppies, we know they're not all going to be identical. And so there may be some dogs that do wonderful passenger screening and others that do person-borne explosives, and some that might actually just need to go to another agency that is looking for support dogs for veterans with PTSD.
Do you know if agencies have developed test standards for their canine units that vary according to the mission?
I don't know specifically. I know that one of our big missions is to actually collect the data because people don't quantitatively evaluate those characteristics. A lot of people will take a test that another organization has used, whether it's relevant or not. And one of our big research questions is, what's the appropriate test? What's the screening that best predicts success in the field that those dogs will end up working in?
Thank you so much, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Dr. Otto. One of the things we talked about is the acceptance rate of U.S. bred dogs is much lower than some of the dogs secured from overseas, particularly Europe. What are some of the best practices that we could put in place to help improve that acceptance rate?
First, I think we have to define the acceptance rate. I think a lot of people are screening dogs looking for specific things, and we're not breeding those dogs or preparing those dogs for jobs in the government. So I think that's the first place that we need to go. And I think that if we're starting to look at what the jobs are, and again, looking at those expectations, that phenotype, we can really impact the dogs early on. In our program, we start training our dogs at 8 weeks of age. And as a result of that, we're able to mitigate a lot of problems that are things that are keeping dogs from being successful, like environmental sensitivity. So from the time our dogs are 8 weeks, they're going on linoleum floors, they're climbing metal stairs, they're used to these environments. They're able to actually enter the workforce at 12 to 18 months. We're also using positive reinforcement training, so that is a really important factor in allowing these dogs, when they are young, to be successful in these pretty intense careers. As long as they're loving what they're doing, it really is something that they are thriving at.
Thank you. Ms. Goff, we've talked about the government procurement process, and that was one of the questions you were asked. Are there improvements that we can use in identifying our standards that we need to acquire to and from, and what are some things that we can do in that regards?
Yes, I think there are some improvements, and I'd also just like to say, I think one of the areas that we can improve is that when we're currently obtaining dogs from overseas, we're getting them at 12 months of age. And to Dr. Otto's point and to several other points, when we get them at 12 months of age, they then go into a training program almost immediately. One of the things that we find to be interesting is that, most breeders already let their dogs go at about 12 weeks. So there's this long period of time that for the dogs that we're obtaining overseas, we don't know what's happening in that period of time. It's one of the challenges that we face. But potentially, by getting more and working more to breed more dogs in the United States, we're going to have a better oversight of what's happening in that period of time, and that means better training, better socialization. To your other question, also potentially increasing the success rate, because it's not what you're picking up at 12 months, like what you're picking up overseas. We're getting a dog what we see is what we get at 12 months, but rather one that we can actually prepare for a much longer period of time to bringing that into the system.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the ranking committee member, Mrs. Watson Coleman from New Jersey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A breeder typically, I'm going to talk about a breeder in this country. A breeder typically holds on to the dog and then will allow the dog to be purchased at what age? Is it 8 weeks, 12 weeks?
Yes. Typically, and of course it varies, but most breeders who are going to let a dog go, let it go at about 8 to 12 weeks of age, getting it to its new home to start socialization and training at that point.
Thank you. So, Lieutenant Smith, if the breeder is letting the dog become available between 8 and 12 weeks, do you purchase the dog at that age and then engage in a year's worth of training? What happens in between? What happens between the time that the breeder has a dog that's eligible to be purchased and you, the end user, actually gets it?
We may have to answer this jointly, but from our end, the breeders, and unfortunately we do typically get ours from Europe through a third-party vendor. So the breeder is obviously in Europe. They're raising it from a puppy up until probably about a year is when the vendor from, Florida, the state of Florida is typically taking a trip to Europe. The dog's going to be about a year old. Vendors have certain tests that they will conduct with the breeders over there, whether or not they want to purchase it. Unfortunately, some of the third-party vendors are like used car salesmen. They want to bring in as many dogs as they can and get rid of them as fast as they can. And some of their testing programs, they'll bring in dogs that don't meet standards for local law enforcement. So then we'll go through the vendor and we run our own series of tests to see if it's a dog that we would want to employ.
And do your dogs get recertified? They get certified in a particular detection or whatever, and then do they get recertified? If so, how often?
Correct. So full-purpose dogs, those 14 that I talked about, and they have a larger job. So that is standardized by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and that's 480 hours of training. And that covers all those areas that I talked about: building searches, area searches, tracking, apprehension. Any odor work after that, narcotics or explosive, is another 160. So, manpower-wise, Dr. Otto touched on the cost for the handler themselves being in training that long. It's probably about 4 to 5 months before, once we get the dog and that handler is on the street with that team.
So, Ms. Goff, tell me this. What needs to be done so that a breeder would hold on, a breeder interested in having the dog purchased for security purposes? What would need to be done to make that happen?
Right. Yeah, great question. There are a couple of things we can do. One of the things we suggest is looking at the incentives currently. What we're dealing with a lot of the really wonderful hunting field trial dogs that we would normally be looking at. One of the problems is that a breeder can sell them at 12 weeks for a comparable price that the government will pay at 12 months. breeder will say, well, you know, I can hold this dog for another year, feed it, you know, train it, medical care, et cetera, and maybe the government will want it. Or I can sell it to this great home down the street that's going to pay the same price. So unfortunately, we have a rather have a disincentive for breeders to be selling to the government. Having said that, AKC has reached out, and we do know people are interested in doing this. One of the things that we think is a critical need, and this goes to your point earlier of what do we do in that year? What happens with the foreign dogs? We don't know what happens with the foreign dogs in that period from 12 weeks to 1 year. But with U.S. dogs, there are several programs out there that have developed relationships with prisons. So you have some prison socialization and training. We found those to be very, very successful. Dr. Otto's program has developed that socialization.
I was going to ask Dr. Otto
Yep.
about a response to this question as well, if you don't mind.
I was dying to tell you.
I couldn't tell that.
Please ask me, please ask me. It's really, and at the beginning, that was really our big challenge. We figured we could get breeders to breed and then sell puppies at 8 to 12 weeks. We knew we had people who wanted dogs at a year to 18 months. And so our big challenge was what happens in that time period. And the Penn Vet Working Dog Center has really been an experiment in what we can do, and we found that it is so valuable to be able to have those dogs, and our dogs come every day to school and are trained and then go home and live with foster families. And so those dogs are able to be tweaked and adjusted and remedial efforts and everything, which is why we think they're so successful. But it's also very labor intensive. And one of our goals is to look at what the cost effectiveness of maybe a prison program, but also maybe a partial prison program, because we know the dogs in the prison programs don't get the environmental exposure that sometimes we need. So some sort of melding of that. There may be kennel programs, there may be a lot of things that we have to research and ask the question, what's the most effective, what is the most cost effective, and also training wise. But I think what we've missed out in so many of these programs is this early childhood development and our ability to really influence the dogs and set them up for success.
Thank you. Thank you. My time is up. I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair now recognizes my colleague from Alabama, Congressman Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Palmer. I want to thank you and Chairman Katko for calling this very important hearing. This is a subject that needs a lot more discussion and prominence with the public, because I don't think the public understands how scarce this resource is and how critically important it is to our national security. Lieutenant Smith, I didn't hear you say where you procured the 14 canines from. Where are they sourced from?
Typically, we've found several third-party vendors throughout the state of Florida. We're currently using one in Miami, Florida right now. We have a local one in New Smyrna Beach, and then we've also used one in the Panhandle near Tallahassee. But again, all those vendors take their trips overseas, pick out their dogs, and bring them back.
So they're procuring them from overseas as well?
Correct.
Okay, they're just, okay. Dr. Otto, you know, one of the things that I have been advocating for in recent years is that we put more emphasis on domestic breeding with the understanding that this would be a subsidized venture by the federal government, with us getting first choice of the product. Why do you think that hasn't happened as we've pushed for this? Why do you think that the universities and the marketplace have not formed a consortium to develop this breeding capacity domestically?
I think it's a great question, and I think that timing is a lot, and the fact that a lot of the agencies weren't talking to each other and breeders weren't talking, and this whole meeting that the AKC hosted was such a great revelation of getting all of the people in the same room so that we could have this discussion and come to the realization that we all need to work together. And I think having a center of excellence to kind of coordinate it, because to be successful, we're going to need a breeding co-op. And a breeding co-op means that we don't have a centralized breeding source, but we have a mechanism to bring all these individuals in together to study it, collect data, look at the different programs of how to raise the dogs from that 8 weeks to the 12 months, and then I call it Working Dog Finder, which is like Puppy Finder, where you actually have the organizations come in and say, I need a dog that does this, this, and this, and the consortium, the co-op has dogs that then they can match up so that we can actually funnel things. I think one of our challenges has been that we've been very narrow. It's like, I only want to work with explosive detection dogs. Well, we know that not every dog is going to be successful in that realm, so we want to make sure that we bring in everybody.
Yeah, well, the way I envision this, and I see the vaporwake explosive detection canines as the top tier, the Cadillac of explosive detections, and then you got the passenger screening canines underneath that. But in my experience, and I've been doing this a long time dealing with this topic, that even if a dog is not capable of those two careers, they can always drop down and be used on the border for drug detection and gun detection, because the Customs and Border Protection are getting dogs from the local pound for that. So I don't see that there'd be any waste in a breeding program that we constructed. But what I hear repeatedly is, well, the reason why it hasn't happened by the private sector is the business case doesn't close. Well, I just think that's because we haven't developed the state-of-the-art dog that we can produce in this country, which brings me to my question. My understanding is that there really isn't a collection of information about these different breeders, the lines that they've developed, that's being centralized for researchers like you to study. Is that accurate, or am I wrong?
That is accurate. We are certainly working, and again, we're looking at even the genetics, but until we can have that quantitative phenotype, so in other words, we can tell specifically numerically what those traits are that we're looking for, it's really hard to look at the genetics and say we should breed this dog to this dog. The International Working Dog Breeding Association has come up with an incredible program where people can put in that information and learn what they call estimated breeding values, so we can make good selection based on those criteria, and that's what's going to move things forward. We know the TSA breeding program made incredible genetic advances over the 10 years that they were there, and that is the kind of thing that we need to be doing, but we need to be collecting the science, we need to have those markers, and we need to know what the genetics is.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that I submit my remaining questions to be provided to the witnesses for them to answer for the record.
We are going to have a second round.
Good.
If you would like to ask those questions, you may do so, or we'll put them in the record.
I'll wait for the second round. I can ask questions longer than they'll put up with me.
With that, I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and there will be a second round of questions. Ms. Goff, one of the issues that prevents increased utilization of domestically bred dogs is the age at which the agencies are able to accept them. For many breeders, that doesn't make sense to hold on to a dog past 8 or 12 weeks when they are typically sent to their new homes for training. Particularly for training for detection or passenger screening. Can you discuss what, if any, steps the American Kennel Club is taking to try to bridge that gap?
Several. A couple of the things that we have looked at, in addition to the aforementioned prison programs, working with some of the universities who are doing the ongoing training, doing a great job of that, is really working with our breeders to convince them to sign on to a program where the dogs that they are producing will be developed for this purpose, and so they are taking a longer-term look at the puppy, particularly if the people who have, a lot of family members who can help out with the socialization. Dog breeding is very much, in many parts of the country, still a very much a family operation. So really holding on to them longer, and then what we envision is making sure that they have all of the knowledge, the science, the research they need to make those dogs as strong as possible. And part of that is by letting the government know, developing some kind of relationship where, because you are able to provide a more stable, a dog that's a lot more training time behind it, you're going to have a greater success, we hope, with getting into the government program. So it's not a concern, that disincentive of I should sell the dog at 12 weeks rather than waiting for 12 months. That's one of the options. Also, our kennel clubs may provide additional options. And then finally, we do have a lot of dedicated fanciers, ex-breeders, who have rather aged out of breeding, but they're still very, very engaged with the dogs. These also present wonderful people to hold on to a puppy, to be puppy foster parents, if you will, for a year or so and really train them, socialize them, and sort of give back.
You said something earlier about a business model and that we don't have a business model for that. Without going into a long answer, I would be interested to know what that business model would look like. And it seems, in listening to your answer then, that that's one of the gaps that we have in getting the dogs that need to be trained for the kind of work that Lieutenant Smith does, that TSA needs done, our armed services. Is there a business model that you guys have come up with?
We think a lot of it is about financial incentive as well, frankly, the ability to do this and to make a living at doing this. And one of the concerns that we've had with the dogs that have been procured overseas is, while the government says that those dogs are cheaper, one of the things that has not been fully investigated is, are they in fact cheaper? And is the government able or paying what we should be paying for these highly valuable resources? It may be a case that the going rate for these dogs should be higher, particularly when you consider and you compare what we'd be paying at 12 weeks for a puppy versus 12 months, and compare what we're paying to sustain overseas buying trips, and all the additional costs that go along with foreign purchase versus domestic purchase. So we are actually very supportive of some language of Mr. Rogers and the Defense Authorization Act that investigates the differences in the costs and tries to set a more realistic cost for purchasing puppies at a later date when they're ready to go.
I'm glad we're going to do a second round, because I'm going to continue to ask you along this line, and I've got questions for Lieutenant Smith and Dr. Otto. And unlike some chairmen, I won't take 10 minutes for 5, so not calling any names, but if we had a different model where we kept these dogs longer so that they're at an appropriate age for this type training, and they didn't measure up, would those animals still be, and Dr. Otto, you can answer this, would those animals still be appropriate for a family to adopt or even be sold? Because most of these dogs are purebred, aren't they? That you could still have a market for that, so that you create a business model where, if the dog doesn't pan out for service with Lieutenant Smith, the dog would still be a viable product that someone else might be interested in.
I can tell you that the list of people who want dogs that don't make it in our program is really long. And because we've had very few dogs that don't make it, we can't even accommodate that. So there are definitely people who are interested, but also using the model where we can have the dogs, if they're not successful in this program, could they be successful in another? So again, defining that phenotype for each and every one of these programs that's using dogs. We can have dogs successful in a whole array of different careers, and then those that aren't successful are going to be very attractive to people who maybe want to compete in sport or just really want a pet. Although a lot of these dogs are pretty high energy, so they're not your average pet, but they still are very, very appealing.
Well, what my point is, it's not necessarily as a pet, but are they marketable? Because what you have here is an overhead cost, and a business is trying to reduce its overhead. So if it's got a primary product that has a high spoilage rate, for instance, the overhead's higher. But if there's a market for these dogs, and as Congressman Rogers pointed out, and we make this from a price point worthwhile, it seems to me that there is a business model that could be developed that would make this work. We will now begin the second round of questions. I will recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I stand ready and willing to take any dogs that you might be available, because we have plenty of room in our yard. Lieutenant Smith, I want to talk to you a little bit more about some kind of boots-on-the-ground examples of the procurement process and the cost-sharing issues, if any. Are you cost-sharing? Are you collaborating with other local agencies? So with that in mind, I want to ask you, I mean, do you coordinate with any state, local, or federal agencies in the procurement process, or do you simply do it on your own? And if you do, how is it working?
Yes, sir. We do it on our own. We call around to those vendors that we've used successfully in the past. And again, sometimes we run into the shortage problem where they're just out of dogs and they haven't taken their trip overseas and their stock, they just don't have it. We'll have to look around a little more. We do collaborate after the purchase process on training because it's not fiscally wise to run a 4 or 5 month training scenario with one dog and one, cop. So we do call around to whether it's municipal or county agencies to see who has new handlers. Basically, that's the problem, is handlers come and go. Every once in a while, you lose a dog from age or medical purposes, and then we'll put on joint training classes to certify that team.
All right, so you've heard from Dr. Otto and Ms. Goff today at length about the procurement processes and some of their suggestions, and it does sound like that is, again, where the problem is, and even for you on the local level, right? Sometimes you can't find a dog, so you've heard some of their suggestions, and I'd ask you to be frank and tell me, what do you think?
I think the business model is going to be a problem. I believe that is the main, I think that's the main problem with people who get into the business model is, I referred to them as used car salesmen earlier. They're not truly in it for the dog, and they're not truly in it for our end purposes. They're in it to make the money. And in order to do that, they have to push a large amount of animals through their inventory quickly. And that, I think that goes to what maybe you were talking about, is how cheap are these dogs and why are they selling them so cheap in Europe? Because realistically, if they've held on to them for a year and they've fed them and they've done the vet test and everything like that, those prices probably should be higher, but for whatever reason, they're not. And that's why we're getting them from over there, because here in the States, when you hold the puppy from 8 weeks to 12 months, they've incurred that bill as the breeder, and they have to recoup that from us. So, whether or not it's the puppy mill terminology, and they have a disregard for the animal itself, and those that don't make it, who knows what happens to those dogs. Some of that probably does happen in Europe, where it's not going to happen here in the States.
So any suggestions on how to address that issue?
Unfortunately, I think that's well above an end user person like myself.
You provided some pretty good insight, though, and I appreciate it. So,
and thank you for the opportunity. But I really I am stuck on how to solve that problem, because I as an end user, I wish we could get our hands on dogs easier, and in that age range of 1.5 to 2 years. Because we have had problems with getting him at a month old. There are age determination problems sometimes when you get him from Europe. Oh yeah, he's 16 months old, and come to find out he's not really 16 months old. He's a year old, and that's a problem. And we've wound up having to return dogs or retire them just because they didn't make it through our training. And obviously the full service training aspect of it is a little more strenuous than the single purpose aspect of it, and they go through a lot more, and that's some of the problems that we have.
Okay. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member, Ms. Demings, for at least 5 minutes, maybe longer, since I got out of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe I'll take a full 15. again, want to thank our witnesses because this has just been so beneficial for us to hear some of the behind-the-scene processes and some of the challenges that we are facing. Dr. Otto, I think we'll begin where we left off, and that's involving the test standards. The TSA Canine teams, of course, work in areas such as airports where there are a tremendous amount of distractions. And does it make sense to you that the TSA would develop test standards that reflect the unique conditions that their canines operate in?
Absolutely. I think it's appropriate.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record a letter from the TSA.
Without objection.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to share a quote from them that says, "Canines displaying a minimum amount of reward drive and search behavior may be acceptable for a canine slated to work single suspect vehicle or occasional VIP motorcade, but it would be unsuitable when the expectation is screening passengers at an airport checkpoint, where the use of canines acceptable to screening persons is still relatively new to explosive detection canines." Dr. Otto, do you agree that more canine teams, or believe that more canine teams are needed at the state and local levels as their responsibilities continue to grow? We've heard Lieutenant Smith share a little bit about the additional use of canines.
I think the demands are, skyrocketing, and it certainly makes me feel more comfortable when I get back on Amtrak to know that there are canines at Union Station.
Are you aware of domestic vendors that are actually working on training canines to meet TSA standards? Are you aware of any vendors that are actually working with the TSA to develop standards for their canine teams?
As far as developing standards, I am not aware. I do know that there are several vendors that are working with TSA, particularly on the person-born explosive detection dog.
Thank you. Can anyone share what is the average cost of requiring a canine and training it, whether single-purpose use or multi-purpose? What's the average cost?
I can tell you that we pay anywhere from $9,000 to $13,000 per dog, and that is before the man hours are adjusted into, in the state of Florida, 480 hours for a full-service dog.
$9,000 to $13,000.
Correct, and that would determine that's based on how much training it has in it already. Vendors sell some dogs that are considered to be titled, and they have more training once we get them.
Ms. Goff, any?
I would have said that we've heard a wide range of numbers based also on the training, but that's along the lines that we've heard.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Otto, we'll talk a little bit about this people working together. You made reference to it a little while ago about the collaboration, the sense of it you're sensing. 10 years ago, roughly, I'm also a member of the Armed Services Committee in addition to Homeland Security. I wanted to try to get the canine community, breeding community, and training community to agree on working together to develop a standard that of physical capability, but also training that the government could rely on for purchasing, whether it's for the military or for Homeland Security. It was impossible to get these folks to work together and agree. Everybody felt their way of training was superior to everybody else. Do you sense that's dissipated in any way or changed? Because you talk about this center of excellence and this sense of cooperation. I worry that we're going to see that devolve again.
I think it's a risk, but I do think there is a change. I think that all of the organizations are realizing that they no longer can get the dogs that they want, and so they're all feeling this pressure, and they realize they need to cooperate. And the fact that we had all of the representatives at the AKC meeting, and we all agreed, on kind of the general direction was really exciting. And I think you laid a lot of the groundwork by setting those, the seeds for that. And I think the timing and the cost and the struggle that people are having is really forcing them to have to work together.
Yeah, I wanted to get to, I think the point Ms. Demings was getting at on the price that folks like you are having to pay. And the government's paying higher than that in some situations for the top-notch canines and I have Auburn in my district, and Auburn's success rate on dogs that can make it as vapor weight, which again is the standard, is about 60 to 70% of the dogs they produce in their breeding program. It's my belief if through organization and research that we can get that production and success rate to 80, 85%, then that business case is going to close so that they can sell that 80 or 85% at the $15,000 or $20,000 level. And then the passenger screening dogs would come in at the 10 or 12,000. And then the dogs that can't do that but could maybe be great for single detection searches or cadaver searches or drug dogs or whatever could be then sold for whatever the market would bear to get the waste out so the business model closes. That's what I'm after in trying to get a breeding program stood up and supported by the federal government. Ms. Goff, DHS has struggled with procurement and writing capabilities requirements for years. What do you think that DHS can do to make more clear what their expectations are when it comes to American Canine Companies and the product that they're wanting to have processed through their screening programs?
Well, first, I'd like to say it's a tough challenge. There's a lot of subjectivity when it comes to training. Having said that, one of the things that we've had with discussions with DHS and vendors is that we need to have specific sort of standards for the baseline of these types of dogs. So that's to say that when you bring one of these dogs in, we're talking about untrained dogs, what they define as untrained dogs. Some of those dogs are going to go on to do additional training and to go to essentially higher levels, like the vapor weight level. But if you can develop a single standard of what a dog who's going to be a detection dog should be able to achieve, whether again, it's environmental, mental, physical, all the various types of health, and then the standards for training spell out.
So are those
what you need that
requirements
dog
not
to do.
written with enough specificity now? Is that your argument?
I'm sorry?
Are those requirements not written with enough specificity?
The requirements are very vague right now. And
What about after action? When somebody goes through the training facility and their dog is not successful, or the screening facility, are you given clear feedback? Are you hearing that they're giving clear feedback about what the shortcomings were?
We have unfortunately heard they have not been getting clear feedback. We have heard a lot of frustration from people who have spent a lot of time providing what they thought the government wanted based on the scope of work, and then have heard that, well, the scope of work can range from anything along a set of guidelines to, well, it is subjective. So we can nail down a clear, concise scope of work. What do these dogs need to do so that they can be better prepared? We think we'll have a better response from breeders and vendors.
Great. My time has expired. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Again, I'd like to offer my final questions for Dr. Otto for the record. And with that, I yield the balance of my time.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies, sir, thank you for being here today. Lieutenant Smith, I was a police officer for 14 years, SWAT operator for 12. Been on hundreds of missions with canine guys, and you're a special breed, no pun intended. So thank you for your service. And I'd like to ask you, this is a nation that's $20 trillion in debt, and of course we have to find the most efficient and wise expenditure of the people's treasure. That's one of the reasons that some of us are pushing heavily for the increased use of canine teams, because some of the alternatives of technology are very, very expensive. And we talk about the expense of a given dog right now being up to 25 grand for a canine. We'll cover that in a second, but let me just ask, Lieutenant Smith, in your career, do you know of any known technology that can duplicate the performance and versatility of a good canine team?
Not even close.
Thank you very much. So let's talk about the expense of the dogs. When you have a broad spectrum detection certification level for a dog, explosives, narcotics, cadaver detection, human spore tracking, each one of these certifications levels, would that not add to the value of a dog if that dog is already certified in that detection technique?
Yes, sir, it would.
And thank you. So you could either buy the dog that's already certified with these various broad spectrum skills, or if you intended for the dog to have that skill, you'd have to send that dog and his trainer to that school, would you not?
You would.
Which would increase the expense of the dog if you make that comparison. I think that's very reasonable, don't you?
Yes.
Okay, so the other expense of a canine dog, is it not the bloodline of the dog? Isn't that considered?
Is that for me?
Isn't that considered? Isn't there sort of a culture amongst canine cops, and I wish my brother was still here, to have a dog with a deep bloodline?
Yes.
Yes. But Ms. Goff, don't you agree? Let me not put words in your mouth, ma'am. I would suggest that dogs bred and raised here in the United States, although their bloodline might not run as deep and appear as pure and pedigreed, they'd still be quite capable of performing as a canine dog. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So if we can shift this culture, LT, from amongst our brothers and sisters that are canine operators, and from having a dog with a deep bloodline to an AKC registered and trained dog, wouldn't you believe that'd be an efficient expenditure to people's treasure and a very effective choice?
Yes, sir, it would.
Okay, let's jump to officer retention and how that impacts. My question to you specific, Lieutenant, is what impact does canine reassignment to a new handler if you lose an officer to another department, or he transfers to another section within your own department and you have to reassign that canine? What generally happens with that dog?
So if you're keeping the same dog and the dog is fully trained, they still have to go through the same amount of training. In Florida, I talked about the 480 hours. They still have to do that 480. It's a little more turnkey for the cop because the dog already knows what he's doing. And it's just a matter of time to get the officer up, but they still have to put those hours in. So that team is off the road and away from those assignments for that 480 hours.
So they can't perform because they're being repaired.
Correct.
Right. And has it been your experience, sir, that sometimes the dogs that cost you less money when you first got them end up to be better performers than the dogs that cost more money?
In some cases, yes.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that this has been thank you for holding this hearing. This has been, I think this is exactly the course of action we need to take on this subcommittee, and I for one, am a loud and vocal advocate for the increased use of canines in their teams. And I thank the ladies and the gentlemen for appearing before us today. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize myself now for a few minutes of questions, as undefined as that might be. Lieutenant Smith, one of the reasons we're holding this hearing is because conversations that I had with Ranking Member Demings and Chairman Katko, and I want to recognize them, and as law enforcement professionals, they've been invaluable in educating me about some of these issues. But the primary concern that I had that I brought up to both of them, and they shared this concern, is the lack of perimeter security at airports. I think all three of us fly every week, and I can't speak for them, but I'm going in and out of airports where it is not rare to see no security at the drop-off point, and then to get inside the airport in the ticketing area and not see any security. Does that concern you?
Yes, absolutely, especially from the history of certain terrorist events.
I would expect that answer. In talking with Ranking Member Demings about the jurisdictional issues between local law enforcement and TSA and trying to decide how this needs to be layered, whether it should be local law enforcement deploying the canines versus TSA, I think that's yet to be resolved. But I do think the issue is that we need more quality dogs. We need a much more visible presence. You made a statement very early on that just the appearance of a dog or a canine unit is a deterrent. And I mentioned airports. I think the same thing's true of surface transportation hubs and major events. This is the primary focus of this is figuring out how do we get more dogs approved and particularly domestic dogs, but how do we get those deployed? What resources do we need to provide to make that happen so that we avoid another catastrophic event like we've just witnessed in Las Vegas?
Well, I think for the end user, no matter how successful you are with the domestic breeding program, and that it's going to come down to a budgetary concern for the local agency. You know, whoever is the authority over the international airport or the domestic airport or whatever, it's going to come down to actually being able to pay for those dogs no matter what the price point is. So whether there's any assistance, you know, from the federal government or anything like that, that's going to be the biggest concern. Because people raise their hand and want to work with a dog, you don't have a shortage of that. You'll have the officers that want to come out and do that job. It's a matter of actually being able to fund it at our level.
One of the things that we were talking about earlier, and Congressman Rogers brought this up, and I think I brought it up in my questions earlier, is reducing the number of dogs that are rejected. And I think one of the ways you do that, Dr. Otto, is that you have very clear evaluation standards. And you have, can you tell us how, for instance, TSA sets and evaluates standards for passenger screening and explosive detection?
I'm afraid I can't tell you how they do that because I haven't worked directly with them. We use the TSA screening process for our puppies to see if they're able to enter in, but I have actually not worked with the TSA at the level of that training and evaluation.
Well, wouldn't it make sense that if local law enforcement, for instance, they have jurisdiction over local airports, if they're within their city limits or their area of jurisdiction, so there's going to be overlap. Wouldn't it make sense that there be set standards across the board so that when you have local law enforcement or other law enforcement interacting with federal agencies like TSA, you've got the dogs all trained to the same standard? And I realize the handlers will, you know, that changes some things somewhat, but wouldn't that make sense that everybody's training to the same standards?
Yes, I believe, and I believe that DHS has been doing some testing, and I think one of the things about the standards too is who is evaluating the dogs. It really does need to be an outside group evaluating the dogs as opposed to an internal assessment, and I think that might be where some of our challenge also comes. If we're sort of evaluating ourselves, we're a little softer than maybe we should be.
Is there enough capacity to supply our domestic needs, whether it's TSA or local law enforcement? Is there enough domestic capacity to provide those dogs?
Currently, I don't think that there is. I think that that's why we need to move on to a dedicated breeding program, and I think we need to realize that there's a 2-year lag from the time we start breeding. So if we want them tomorrow, we needed to be planning this 2 years ago.
Okay, that goes back to the business model that I think we're going to have to develop, and the resources that Congressman Rogers mentioned. Unless there are other members with questions, I thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. I would like to just make this point. Again, this has been a very collaborative effort by both subcommittees, and even though Chairman Katko and Ranking Member Demings and I began talking about these issues months ago, the timeliness of this joint hearing is not lost on the members of these two subcommittees. The horror that we saw taking place in Las Vegas Sunday night loomed large over us as another reminder of the dangers that we all face and the responsibility that we share to ensure the safety and security of all Americans. And to echo what has already been said, we pray for the grieving families who have lost friends and loved ones, and pray for the full recovery of those who are injured. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. If there's no further business without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned.